complete.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Nico Bree, and in this episode of How I Do My Detail series, we're going to address how I scale my details after I have developed my style. I'd like to note that this is for models with virtually no polygon restrictions and can be used in renderings for movies or images. So without further ado, let's get into it. So we've established what model we're making and our style. Now it's time to work out our detail scale. So the way that I see it, there are three kinds of detail scales that I can think of. There's the Gribble intensive detailing, so think Star Wars Super Star Destroyer trench type detail. Then there's texture-based detailing, so think programs in Blender or 3ds Max that allow you to create your own detailing through various technical photo tricks. And then there's a fusion detailing, which is my style, and it blends the aspects of both the texture-based detailing as well as the Gribble intensive detailing. So when we're talking about the Gribble intensive detailing, you want to think back to the days of the OG Star Wars, Star Trek, Starship Troopers, Battlestar Galactica, and really you have to think all of those, or for the most part, a lot of those scenes that you see in those OG shows were kit-based ships. They were handmade and they had no CG whatsoever, or if there was CG, it was very, very, very little because it was not developed to where it is now and what we use today. So the way that they had to scale their ships and just depict their detailing is they had to use a lot of Gribbles. And I'll use my example that I mentioned earlier with the Super Star Destroyer. It was supposed to be depicted as this huge overbearing command ship that Darth Vader used, and it was essentially a Star Destroyer on steroids. So aside from its more kind of sleek, narrower but long kind of triangular shape, they compensated for the size of the ship by adding an immense amount of Gribbles to it. And for those who don't necessarily know what Gribbles are essentially just randomized shapes that are assembled and arrayed throughout a spacecraft to symbolize a more mechanical, large structure being put together. And I mean, perfect examples are just, like I said, the Star Destroyers, and also Battlestar Galactica, the Galactica itself, as well as in Starship Troopers, the Corvette class ships that they used to carry the mobile infantry, they were heavily Gribbled as well. And one thing that I do want to point out though is since we're talking about the OG shows, one thing that's really important, and I think is a perfect example of what I mean by, developing your style and determining what scaling that you want to use in your model, is Star Trek used Gribbles as well, but in comparison to Star Wars and Starship Troopers and Battlestar Galactica, was they used a lot of smooth surfaces, a lot of flush and just aesthetically pleasing surfaces, because their style was depicting a futuristic idea of the world, and it just so happened back then that was the style. That was where a lot of aesthetics were kind of moving to, which was like this smooth, sleek kind of dynamic and aesthetic. And it was really interesting too, because you have like shows like the Jetsons that kind of depicted that as well, where they had like the flying cars and stuff like that. So all of that essentially was how that detailing was done, and what you can use in your models as well, if that's the way that you want to do. If you want to kind of stay true to like that OG type of theme, then Gribble work is definitely something that you are going to want to get into. Now, in the world of 3D modeling in SketchUp and in other programs, the Gribble method can work to a great effect depending on how you want to convey your ships and if you would like to convey a more OG technical, what I like to call built with a billion pieces from a plethora of manufacturers look. And to convey this, like I mentioned before, you essentially just take a slew of general purpose shapes, whether it be rectangles, squares, spheres, and you essentially just morph them together and you copy and array those details along your ship where it makes sense. And you can continue to do that until you have a desired scale or to your heart's desire, really. Although I personally don't want to go too far down this particular style because this series is more particular to how I do my models, and I don't want to kind of do just the general sense because I feel like if you can use me as a basis, then you can hopefully build your own foundation. I want to kind of do something different than just the general stuff. Moving on to the next topic, we have texture-based detailing, which stems from the creation of CGI and 3D animation programs. Without going into too crazy of the history of it all, basically computer technology made it so we don't need to use the Gribble method as much, if at all, because we can just digitally paint the details onto the surfaces of our ships with little to no effort. This makes modeling ships like the Super Star Destroyer much easier, and instead of having to model the hundreds of thousands of polygons worth of Gribbles, we can just settle for maybe half of that and use the digital magic to fill in the rest. This kind of goes into my style, but I do like to use elements of the Gribble style to make my ships pop a little bit more. Moving on to our final detailing type, we have the fusion, which essentially combines the Gribble aspects as well as the texture-based aspects of detailing into one. And the reason why I like this detailing style and why it suits my ship's needs is I like using Gribbles in succession and, where it makes sense. And then I like to use the built-in SketchUp painting and texturing tools to paint over those details and essentially combine them into one product. And an example is actually in this Zakil frigate that's being remodeled right now. The idea for that ship is that it's going to be scaled relatively bigger than my fighters and corvettes. So to convey that without having to put my ships side by side, I make sure that I use the real estate on the model to convey the fusion of essentially the billion pieces from a billion manufacturer style, and then using the detail painting of the second style into one. And when I do, I typically use the cut, extrude, push, pull details, and of course the plugins that I've mentioned in previous videos to give the ship its depth. And one way that I really like to think about my ships when I'm modeling them is it's almost like you can feel the grooves, indentions, and like the ribbed details, almost like the model was real. And I kind of picture that when I'm actually designing the model, and I kind of put myself in the alternate universe, if you will, of my world, and I make it as if I was literally designing it to be real. And with that, I take, of course, the references and the ideas that I mentioned in the first video in the overview, and I have those other pieces of reference and an art to help me convey that realism piece to the world. And that's essentially how I built my style. At least that's the nitty gritty of it, or the headcanon piece of it. And essentially that aspect of my style is what makes it aimed essentially more towards rendering as well versus video games, because like I said before, the more detail that you have and the more polygons that you have on a particular model will definitely contribute to the amount of computer processing is going to be needed to make that model do what you want it to do. So now that we have a general understanding of the types of details that there are out there and my particular detailing style, how do we know what kind of details to use and how much, and what makes a model quote unquote finished, if there even is such a state? And to answer that question is that it truly depends on how realistic you want your model to be, and at the end of the day, it depends on your style. You may have to ask yourself, do I want my spacecraft to look like it's grounded in a more realistic science fiction light, or is the goal to be different than that and more of a stretch at the imagination? Examples being ships in like the science fiction show The Expanse. They have a design style that suits a realistic, or at least a semi-realistic depiction of how humanity will survive in a spacefaring civilization a few centuries from now. The writers and designers intended for that style to be as close to home as possible while still maintaining the fiction element. Battlestar Galactica, the reimagined series, also to a degree utilizes some elements of semi-realistic depictions of how humanity will live in space, but they have more far-reaching technologies than, say, The Expanse. They have, for instance, sublight engines that help ships traverse distances arguably much faster than The Expanse Epstein's drives. And on top of that, they have FTL drives that make their space mechanics work completely different. So their style of ships will fit more towards their world mechanics. How will you design your engines? How will they look? You know, questions like that will help you narrow down the detailing of your ships and your model in general. And essentially that will build your style by answering that question. And since we're on the topic of Battlestar Galactica and The Expanse, some notable details of the spacecraft that maybe sometimes you may not have noticed, or you have noticed but didn't think to add to your ships, is maneuvering engines, for instance, rib structures, or the more scaffolding industrial looking vessels, for instance. Those minute details that sometimes you gloss over when you're just looking at the show, or you're in the heat of the show, you know, engrossed in the universe, you know, those details really bring out the style and the world that those ships belong in. So focusing in on that and using that as focus points and inspiration for your style is crucial. It's literally what brought me to the skill level that I am today, is constantly watching Battlestar Galactica ships in their scene setup, their design, the Gribbles, the textured aspects, trying to depict which details are Gribbled, which details aren't Gribbled, all of that. And it's just constantly looking and mimicking as much as I can, while also adding my own flair to it. On my final point, I would like to note that for my style of spacecraft, I typically like to depict my maneuvering engines because I like the more semi-realistic approach to Newtonian physics and to how ships traverse and solve issues within my universe. So I believe, to a degree, having a kind of lore-based idea or with lore-based background for your models can definitely help you visualize what details will be needed in order to reach at least somewhat closer to the quote-unquote finished state of the model. And on that final note, I would like to end this video with a question for you, the viewers. When designing your ships, what aspects of realism or fiction do you implement in your designs, and how do you depict them? Or do you rather not depict them and just focus on the more core fundamentals that we've mentioned in the overview video? Answer in the comments if you like, and I would like to thank you again for indulging me on this topic and hope that this helps you kind of elaborate more on the purpose of the model that you're making and the reason why you add certain details or lack thereof details. And please like, subscribe, and share around if you found this insightful. And I will see you guys in the next one.